My name is Charlie, and the year I died started like any other, with my hands shaking and the lights in the ceiling humming a frequency the rest of the station could not hear. I lived on a place called Brace 9. It was not really a station so much as a tumor that humans had grown on the side of a dead moon after the infinity took our worlds and decided to let what was left of us breathe in tin cans at the edge of nothing. I had a bunk, a ration card, and a habit. The habit had a name. We called it Zoots. The aliens did not know we called it that. They knew it by its proper name, the one printed on the canisters in their flat, looping script. But to me and the other broken men on Brace 9 it was Zoots, and we were zoo heads. And that was the whole of our identity by the time the infinity got around to deciding what to do with us. A Zoot did not make you happy. People always think drugs are about happiness. They are not. A Zoot ate your memory from the back of your skull forward, and while it ate, it gave you a soft, warm, drowning feeling like sinking through wet cotton. The first time you took one, you forgot what the inside of your childhood house looked like. The second time, you forgot a face. By the time you were a real zoo head, you no longer knew which of your memories had been yours to begin with, and which had been borrowed from the man in the bunk above you. We traded memories like cigarettes. I had a wedding in my head that I am almost certain belonged to a dockhand named Pell, and a son I had never fathered, and a kitchen with yellow walls that I would have killed to get back to even though I had never stood in it. I do not tell you this to be poetic. I tell you this because it is the reason I am the one who is still here to talk. Megan kept me alive in those years the way you keep a dog alive that is not interested in living. She was small and dark and had a temper that ran cold instead of hot, and she had not touched a Zoot in her life, which on Brace 9 made her something close to a saint. She worked the medical lottery for the refugee block, sorting tickets, calling numbers, watching old men get pulled out of line for treatments that never came. She came home to our compartment every night smelling of disinfectant and somebody else's blood, and she would sit on the edge of the cot and take my hand and ask if I had eaten, and I would lie to her, and she would know I was lying, and she would feed me anyway. Barton was the other one. Barton was a tech, the kind of man who could open up an infinity console with a piece of bent wire and a curse, and who had not been afraid of anything since the day his daughter went into one of the clinics and did not come out. He drank, and he muttered, and he kept a collection of small machines in his quarters that no human had any business owning. I was useful to him because I could carry things, and because the aliens did not look twice at a zoo head. Megan tolerated him because she knew, the way women know these things, that one day Barton would either save us or get us all killed, and either way we would need him for it. The three of us were not a family. We were too damaged to be a family. We were a thing the aliens had not yet found a word for, and we lived in the cracks between their attention, and that suited us right up until the day the lottery called my number. I should tell you about Brace 9 itself because the place mattered. The place had a smell, and the smell told you everything you needed to know. It smelled of recycled air and old solder, and the particular sour breath of men who have not had fresh protein in 8 months. The corridors were narrow. The corridors were always narrow, because the station had been built fast, by humans, in the bad years after the surrender, when the infinity had let us throw together habitats in exchange for promises we had no choice but to make. The ceilings were low. The lights were the lights you get when a contractor is paid in ration script, which is to say they hummed and they flickered, and every third one had been dead for as long as I had lived there. The walls were stamped with serial numbers in human script, which was the closest thing to defiance any of us were allowed. There were 9,000 of us on Brace 9. There had been 12,000 at the start. The math told you where the other 3,000 had gone, and you did not need to be a tech to do the math. I want to tell you about a man named Vargas, because Vargas is the kind of man this story tends to forget, and he should not be forgotten. Vargas had the bunk across from mine. He had been an infantry sergeant before the surrender, and he had a scar across the bridge of his nose where a piece of his own helmet had gone the wrong way during the last fight for Halsey, and he was a heavier zoo head than I was. He had been at it longer. By the time I knew him, he had no past at all. He did not know his own first name. He did not know if he had ever been married. He could not have told you what his mother looked like, because his mother had been the first thing the Zoots ate, and after his mother there had been nothing left to anchor anything else. But he remembered perfectly the field manual for the rifle he had carried at Halsey. He could field strip it blind. He could recite the maintenance schedule. He could tell you the muzzle velocity in 3 different atmospheres. The Zoots had eaten everything else in his head, but they had not eaten the rifle, because the rifle had been drilled into him so hard and so often that it had become a part of his body, not his mind. There is a lesson in that, and I did not understand the lesson until much later, but I am telling you now so you will have it earlier than I did. The things you drill into yourself hard enough survive even the eating. Remember that. Drill the things that matter. Vargas died about a year before my notice came. He died in his bunk quietly because his mind had finally finished eating itself, and there was nothing left for his body to point at. Megan was the one who found him. She did not cry. She closed his eyes with 2 fingers and she went and got the recyclers, and that was that. His bunk was reassigned within a week. A young one took it, a kid of 19 who had just started on the Zoots. The kid did not last 6 months. By the time my notice came, the bunk had been reassigned a 3rd time, to a woman who had lost 3 children to the lottery, and who was working her way through her own supply of Zoots as fast as her hands could carry them to her mouth. This is the kind of place Brace 9 was. This is the kind of life we had. I'm not telling you to make you pity us. I am telling you so you understand what the Infinity were drinking, and why they thought they would never be stopped. They were drinking from the bottom of the cup. They were drinking from the people no one else cared about. They had picked us specifically. Refugees, addicts, men with no past and women with no children, and old soldiers with scars on their faces and field manuals in their heads. They thought we were the safest meat to eat because nobody would come looking for us when we did not come back. That was their reasoning. That was the cold, flat shape of the recursion they had run on us before they ever opened a clinic. They had calculated. They had concluded that we were beneath notice. They were correct. We were beneath notice. That was the problem. Things beneath notice can move, and you do not see them moving until they are already at your throat. The notice came through the wall slot at 0600 station time. I remember because the slot made a clicking sound that I had taught myself to sleep through, and that morning it woke me, and I lay in the dark for a long time before I got up to read it. Megan was already gone to her shift. The notice was a thin sheet of alien polymer, warm to the touch, with my name printed at the top in a font that was almost but not quite Roman letters. It said I had been selected for rehabilitation. It said I should report to the Infinity facility on the inner ring at 1400. It said attendance was not optional. I sat on the cot and held that sheet for what felt like a long time. I had heard about rehabilitation. Every zoo head on Brace 9 had. The Infinity ran clinics for us. They had been running them for 2 years, ever since the high command of the occupation had decided that our addiction was a productivity issue. The clinics promised a cure. The cure involved a procedure, the details of which were never published, and the men who came back from the clinics did not come back the same. Some of them came back clean. Some of them came back hollow. Some of them did not come back at all, and the rest of us pretended not to notice when their bunks were emptied and reassigned. I waited until Megan came home at 1100. I showed her the notice. She read it twice. She set it down on the table between us, and she did not look at me, and she said, in a voice so flat I knew she had practiced the flatness, that it would be fine, that the clinics were not all bad, that if I just did what they said and did not make trouble, I would come home to her, and we would have my real memories back, and we could start over. I told her I did not have any real memories to come back to. She did not laugh. She put her hand on the side of my face and held it there for a count of 10, and then she got up and went to find Barton. Barton came to our compartment at 12:45. He brought a satchel and a bottle and a look on his face that I had only seen once before, the night his daughter's bunk was assigned to a new man. He sat down across from me, and he opened the satchel, and he laid 3 things on the table. A small black disc the size of a coin, a sliver of metal that looked like a sewing needle but was not, and a piece of folded paper. He told me to listen, and listen carefully, because he was only going to say it once. The procedure, he said, was called memory looping. The infinity would put me in a chair. They would find a memory of mine from before the zoots, a memory of myself when I was clean, when I was whole, when my mind was not eating itself. They would loop me into that memory. They would let me live inside it. The theory was that my mind, regressed to a state before the damage, would heal itself. The theory was elegant. The theory worked sometimes for some patients, for reasons no human had been allowed to study. The truth, Barton said, was uglier. The truth was that the infinity were not healers. They were harvesters. Their species did not experience time the way we did. They lived in recursion. Their whole biology, their whole society was built around going back, going back, going back, eating the same hour 10,000 times and digesting something from it on each pass. They had come to our worlds because they had run out of their own recursion to eat. They had found us. They had found that human memory, especially damaged human memory, was the richest food source they had ever encountered. The clinics were not curing us. The clinics were farming us. Every zoo head who went into a chair was being looped through his own best memory while the infinity drank what came off the top. Most patients, Barton said, eventually wore out. The loop would degrade. The memory would thin. The patient would be left with nothing, no past, no present, just a long, soft, drowning feeling, like sinking through wet cotton. And then the patient would die and the bunk would be reassigned, and another notice would go out from the wall slot at 0600. I asked him how he knew. He said his daughter had told him, in a dream, 3 weeks after she was buried. I did not ask him to clarify. I have lived long enough to know that some men come by their information through channels you do not interrogate. He pushed the 3 objects across the table. The disc, he said, was a recorder. I was to swallow it before I went into the chair. It would sit in my stomach and listen, and if I came back out, he could pull it and read it, and we would know more than any human had ever known about what the infinity actually did in those rooms. The needle was a stem. If at any point inside the loop I felt myself starting to slip, starting to forget that I was inside a loop at all, I was to find a way to use the needle on myself. The pain, he said, would punch through. Pain was the one thing the infinity could not reliably edit. They did not have nerves the way we did. They did not understand what hurting was for. The paper was the last thing. He unfolded it slowly. On it, in his cramped engineer's handwriting, were 3 words. You are Charlie. He told me to memorize them. He told me to write them on the inside of my eyelids if I had to. He told me that no matter what the loop showed me, no matter how warm and yellow and good it felt, if I could remember those 3 words, I could remember everything else eventually, and I could come back. I memorized them. I swallowed the disc. I slid the needle into the seam of my sleeve where Megan had sewn me a little pocket 2 years ago for keeping ration chits. I put the paper in my mouth and chewed it until it was pulp, and I swallowed that too. Megan came back at 13:40. She did not ask what Barton and I had been doing. She put on her coat and she walked me to the inner ring, the whole long curve of it, past the recycling vents and the prayer alcoves and the line of men waiting for the water ration, and she held my hand the entire way and did not say a single word. At the door of the clinic, she stopped. She turned me toward her. She looked up at my face for a long second, and then she reached up and she pressed her thumb against my forehead, hard, the way a priest might mark a child, and she said, in that flat voice I knew was practiced, that I had better come back. I went inside. The clinic was clean in a way nothing on Brace 9 was clean. The air smelled like nothing. The walls were the soft pale color of the inside of a shell. An infinity attendant met me at the door. They were tall, the infinity, taller than us, and thin in a way that suggested their bones had been grown rather than evolved. Their faces were not faces in the way we understood faces. They had a region where the eyes should have been, but it was smooth, and instead of features they had a system of small dimples that pulsed in slow, deliberate patterns when they were thinking. I had been told once, by a man who studied them before he went into a chair himself, that the dimples were how they tracked time, the way we used clocks. Each dimple was a recursion. Each pulse was an hour they had already eaten. The attendant did not speak. The infinity rarely spoke aloud to us. They communicated through the polymer sheets and through the dimples and through small mechanical voices that came out of the walls when there was something they specifically wanted us to hear. The attendant gestured. I followed. The room they put me in was round. There was a chair in the center. The chair was the chair you have already imagined, a soft, contoured thing, more womb than furniture, with a hood that would come down over the head. There were 3 more attendants in the room. None of them looked at me. They were too busy to look at me. To them I was not a patient. I was a meal in a coat. They sat me down. They lowered the hood. The hood was lined on the inside with the same soft pale shell color as the walls, and it pressed gently against my temples, and it smelled, faintly, of nothing at all. A voice came from inside the hood. The voice was small and mechanical and not quite female and not quite male. The voice said, "Be still, find your best day, hold it in your mind, the procedure will begin." My best day. I had a moment of panic then, because I realized I did not know what my best day was. I had used so many zoots that my best days had been eaten away years ago. I had a wedding in my head that was not mine. I had a kitchen with yellow walls that I had never stood in. I had nothing of my own that was clean enough to hold. And then from somewhere very deep, I found one. I found a morning. I was 19. I had not yet touched a zoot. I was on the deck of a hauler off the rim of Mars Station, my first real job, and the sun was coming up over the curve of the planet, and an old engineer named Hoss had handed me a cup of bad coffee and called me kid, and I had felt, for one whole minute, like a man who was about to do something with his life. I held that morning. I held it the way you hold a candle in a draft. The chair hummed, the hood went warm, the room peeled away. I was on the deck of the hauler, the sun was coming up. Hoss handed me the coffee, he called me kid. I felt the warmth of the cup, I tasted the bitterness. The light hit the side of my face. I was 19, I was clean. I was a man who was going to do something with his life. Then Hoss handed me the coffee again, and called me kid, and the sun came up, and the light hit the side of my face. And again. The first 3 or 4 passes I did not notice. The 4th or 5th I noticed, but I told myself I was tired. By the 10th I knew something was wrong, but the morning was so good, and I was so young, and the coffee tasted so right, and I let myself sink into it the way you sink into a hot bath when you have been cold for years. By the 20th I had stopped counting. By the 50th I was no longer sure I had ever been anywhere else. The hauler was my whole world. Hoss was the only person I had ever known. The sun came up. The coffee was bitter. The light hit the side of my face. The sun came up. I do not know how long I was in there. Time inside the loop did not work. You could not count. Because counting required there to be a difference between this minute and the last, and there was no difference. The same gesture, the same words, the same light. I was being eaten and I was loving it. There were small things I noticed, eventually, that I could not have noticed at first. The deck of the hauler had a particular pattern of wear under the chair where Hoss was sitting, a worn place where his boots had scuffed the paint over decades. On the early passes, the wear was detailed. You could see the faint scratches in the metal, the dull places where the paint had thinned. On the later passes, the wear was smoother. The scratches were going away. The dull places were filling in. The infinity were not just drinking the warmth and the bitterness. They were drinking the imperfections one by one, because imperfections take energy to render, and the loop only needed to render what would keep me happy. A perfect deck, a perfect cup, a perfect old man, a perfect light on the side of my face. The loop was getting cleaner and cleaner, and cleaner in this case meant emptier. They were sanding me down. There was also Haas himself. The first time I had lived that morning, in the real world, 20 years before, Haas had been a particular man. He had been gray at the temples but still dark on top. He had had a small white scar at the corner of his mouth from a fight on a freighter a decade earlier. He had had thick eyebrows that he used like punctuation when he talked. The early passes in the loop showed me this Haas. The middle passes showed me a Haas who was a little less specific. The temples were still gray, but the scar at the corner of his mouth had thinned. The eyebrows were still thick, but they did not move quite the way I remembered. By what must have been the 80th pass, I was looking at a Haas who was no longer Haas but a kind of generic old engineer, a Haas shape, a Haas who would have been recognizable to me only because I had no one else to compare him to. They had not just been drinking my memory of the morning. They had been drinking my memory of him. They had been drinking the man. I think that more than anything else was what woke the small, hard, cold thing inside me up. Not the variations in his voice, not the smoothing of the deck. The fact that Haas was being eaten, and Haas had been a good man, and Haas had not deserved to be eaten a second time after dying once already in the real world. Haas had died 7 years before the surrender, in his sleep, on a station I never visited, and he had not asked to be brought back to be drunk. The Infinity were grave robbers. They were grave robbers who had reached down into my head and taken a dead man, and were now eating him in front of me a piece at a time. That is when the 3 words came back. I do not know how the words got back into my head. I had not consciously remembered them. But on the 100-and-something pass, when Haas called me kid in his very slightly wrong way, the 3 words came up from underneath the loop like a body coming up out of cold water. You are Charlie. I was Charlie. I was on brace 9. I had a woman who had pressed her thumb against my forehead. I had a man who had handed me a needle. I was being eaten alive in a soft, pale, shell-colored room. The realization did not break the loop. It did something subtler. It put a small, hard, cold thing inside the loop like a stone in a shoe. The sun came up. Haas called me kid. I drank the coffee, and underneath all of it I knew, and the knowing did not go away. I let several more passes go by while I worked out what to do. The needle was in my sleeve, but in the loop I was 19 and I was not wearing the sleeve. I was wearing the work coveralls of a hauler deckhand, and the needle was not there because the loop was generated from my memory, and my memory of that morning did not include the needle. The needle existed only in the real world, in the chair, in the soft, pale, shell-colored room. I had to get to it. This is the part I have told no one, not even Megan. I have not told her because I do not know how to make her understand without making her sick. The way I reached the needle was that I bit my own tongue. I bit it hard. I bit it on the next pass in the moment when Haas handed me the coffee. I bit it so hard that I tasted the iron flood of my own blood, and the pain was the kind of pain that a 19-year-old on the deck of a hauler off the rim of Mars station has no business feeling. And the pain, just like Barton had said, punched through. For 1 second I saw the chair. I saw the hood. I saw the soft, pale, shell-colored room. I saw my own arm. I saw the seam of my sleeve where Megan had sewn the little pocket 2 years ago for keeping ration chits. Then the loop snapped me back. The sun came up. Haas called me kid. But the next pass I bit again. And the next. And each time the chair flickered in for a moment longer. And each time my hand learned a little better where my sleeve was. And on what must have been the 40th bite, I got my fingers into the seam, and I got the needle into my palm, and I jammed it into the meat of my thigh as hard as a half-starved man with a half-eaten mind can jam anything. The world tore open. I was in the chair. I was screaming. The hood was lifting. The attendants were moving toward me, and the dimples in their smooth, shell-colored heads were pulsing very fast, faster than I had ever seen them pulse, and I understood with a clarity that was its own kind of horror that they were upset. The Infinity did not get upset often. The Infinity had not had to get upset in 2 years. A meal had stood up off the plate. I do not remember exactly what happened next, because what happened next had the quality of a dream you wake up from with your shirt soaked through. I remember pulling the hood the rest of the way off. I remember the attendant on my left reaching for me, and his hand was wrong. His hand had too many joints, and his fingers folded the wrong way. And I do not know if that was a hallucination from the Zoots, or whether the infinity simply did not show us their real hands when they wanted us calm. I remember the wall opening. I remember a corridor. I remember running. I remember very clearly the moment I came out of the inner ring door and Megan was still there. She had not left. She had stood by the door for the entire procedure, the way a dog stands by a door, and when she saw me, her face did a thing that human faces are not supposed to do, an opening and a closing at the same time, and she caught me under the arms as I fell against her, and she dragged me into the crowd. We made it back to the compartment because Barton had told her, before any of this started, the 3 back routes the security drones did not patrol. We made it back because Megan had memorized those routes the way I had memorized You Are Charlie. We made it back because the infinity, for all their patience and their recursion and their billion-year hunger, did not understand that a small dark woman in a refugee block coat could move faster than a security drone if she had a reason. We made it back. We bolted the door. Barton was already there. He pulled the disc out of me an hour later, with a tool he had made for the purpose, and he plugged it into a console he had stolen, and the 3 of us sat around that console for the rest of the station night, and we watched what the disc had recorded. You have to understand, the disc had not just recorded the room, it had recorded the loop. It had recorded what the infinity had done inside my head. It had recorded the small, mechanical, not quite female, not quite male voice that had told me to find my best day, and then it had recorded what the voice had said next, after I went under, after I was supposed to be too far gone to hear. The voice had said in the same flat tone, Subject Charlie is 3rd grade harvest. Yield estimated at 140 hours of clean recursion. Begin draw. 3rd grade, there were grades. We watched the rest of the recording. The voice cataloged me. It cataloged the morning on the hauler. It cataloged Hoss. It cataloged the bitterness of the coffee. It assigned values to each of these things in their flat looping script, and then it began the draw, and you could hear the infinity drinking. They did not drink with mouths. They drank with the dimples. Each pulse was an hour. Each hour was a piece of me. And underneath the drinking, you could hear, very faintly, a sound that none of us at first could identify, until Barton, who had drunk 1/3 of his bottle by then, said it without looking up. Other patients. The recording was picking up the other rooms in the clinic. The disc was sensitive enough to catch the loops next door, and the loops next door, and the loops next door. There were hundreds of them. Each one was a man or a woman strapped to a chair, looping through their best day, while the infinity drank them down to the bone. Megan got up from the console and went into the corner of the compartment and put her hand over her mouth and did not make a sound for a full minute. When she took her hand away, she came back and sat down, and she said, in that flat voice of hers, "What are we going to do?" Barton said, "We were going to burn it down." I want to be honest about what we did next, because the story has been told other ways, and most of the other ways are kinder to us than we deserve. We did not have a plan to free the patients. We had a plan to kill them. I know how that sounds. I have heard how it sounds. Megan and I had it out about it for 2 hours in the compartment, and Barton sat at the table and drank and did not interrupt, because Barton had already had this argument with himself the night his daughter went into the clinic and did not come out. The patients in the chairs were too far gone. The recording made that clear. They were not people any longer. They were memory being drunk. If we cut the power, if we breached the rooms, if we got them out into the corridor, the best that would happen was that they would wake up empty, and they would wander Brace 9 for a few weeks not knowing their own names, and then they would die anyway, and they would die scared. The worst was that the infinity would simply recollect them and start over. What we could do, what we could actually do, with a stolen console and a tech with a grudge and a zoo head who had bitten his way out of a loop, was bring the clinic down. All of it. Power, cooling, recursion array, every console, every chair, every soft, pale, shell-colored wall. We could give the patients in the chairs a clean end inside the loops they were already inside, instead of a long, thin one with the Infinity drinking. We could destroy the Infinity's harvest infrastructure on Brace 9. We could make them have to build it again, and while they were building it, fewer of us would be eaten. It was not a good thing to do. It was the least bad thing available. Megan agreed at the end of the second hour. She agreed in the same flat voice she had used when she pressed her thumb against my forehead. She said, "All right." She said, "But I am the one who throws the switch. Because if anybody is going to have to live with that, it is going to be the one of us who is still whole." I did not argue with her. There was no arguing with her. Barton did not argue with her either. We spent the next 11 days getting ready. I will not tell you how, because most of how is still being used by people who are still alive and still doing the work, and the Infinity do not need to read this and know. I will tell you that Barton had been preparing for this for 2 years, since the day his daughter went into the clinic, and that he had a quantity of things in his quarters that no human had any business owning, and that all of those things came out of their hiding places that week and were put together into one device the size of a footlocker. I will tell you that I went outside 3 times, twice with Megan and once on my own, and that I had to be a zoo head in front of the security drones each time, slouching, slurring, my eyes loose in my head, and that this was not a difficult performance because I was a zoo head, and the only thing the role required was that I not look up. I will tell you that the night before we did it, Megan made me sit on the cot, and she took out a small mirror, and she had me look at myself, and she made me say the 3 words aloud. "You are Charlie." She made me say them 10 times. She said she did not want me to lose them in the noise. I said them 10 times. I said them an 11th time for her. The morning we did it, the station was running on its low cycle, which is what we had been waiting for. The clinic had only 1 attendant on the door instead of 3. Barton went in first, with the footlocker disguised as a maintenance crate, and he had papers, and the papers were good, because Barton had been a tech long enough to know which papers a maintenance crate needed. I went in second. I went in as a returning patient, which is to say, I went in shaking and slurring with the notice from my wall slot held in front of me like a man holding a flame in a wind. The Infinity attendant at the door looked at me with his smooth, shell-colored face, and the dimples on his head pulsed in a slow pattern, and he gestured me through. He did not remember me. The Infinity did not remember individual zoo heads. We were food. You do not remember a grain. Megan did not come in. Megan stayed at the door of the inner ring, where she had been the first time, because she was the one who was going to throw the switch, and the switch was outside. I will not give you the rest minute by minute. There is a kind of obscenity in narrating that part. What I will give you is the shape of it. The clinic that morning was almost empty by Brace 9 standards. The low cycle was when the Infinity ran skeleton staff, because their attendants needed something they called rest, although none of us understood what an Infinity at rest actually did. We had counted over 11 days that the door attendant changed shift at 0640. We had counted that the corridor attendants did a sweep at 0710, at 0740, and at 0810. We had a window of about 28 minutes between the second sweep and the third. Barton needed 16 of those minutes. I needed about 4 of them. Megan needed 2. Barton went in first, with the footlocker disguised as a maintenance crate, and he had papers, and the papers were good, because Barton had been a tech long enough to know which papers a maintenance crate needed. He walked past the door attendant without slowing down. The door attendant scanned the papers, ran one of the slow pulses through the dimples on his shell-colored head, and gestured Barton through. The footlocker rolled on small wheels and sounded like a footlocker rolling on small wheels. I went in second. The notice from my wall slot was in my left hand. I had not eaten that morning. I had taken a small dose of one of Barton's compounds, a thing he had made for the purpose that made my eyes go a little loose and my hands shake a little harder because the attendant on the door had seen me before and we did not want him to look twice. He did not look twice. He scanned the notice. His dimples pulsed. He gestured me through. He did not remember me. The infinity did not remember individual zoo heads. We were food. You do not remember a grain. The corridor inside the clinic was longer than I had remembered, because the first time I had walked it I had been walking toward the chair, and a corridor that takes you toward a thing you are afraid of is always shorter than a corridor that takes you back through a thing you have survived. The walls were the same soft pale shell color. The air still smelled like nothing. I could hear, very faintly, the hum of the recursion array through the floor. I had not heard it the first time. The first time I had been too far gone with terror. This time I heard it, and I understood it for what it was, and the sound of it made the meat of my thigh remember the needle. I walked past 3 doors that had men in them. I knew there were men in them because the doors had small windows at head height, and through the windows I could see the soft contour of a chair and the hood lowered overhead. The hood blocked the face. The hand on the armrest was all you saw. The hand on the first door was an old hand, the kind of hand that has done 60 years of work and has the joints to show for it. The hand on the second door was a young hand, and there was a wedding band on it. The hand on the third door was a woman's hand, and I made myself look at it, and I made myself remember it, because if any one of us was going to come out of this, somebody had to carry those 3 hands forward. I went down the corridor I was not supposed to go down. It was the corridor that led to the cooling stack. Barton had told me to go there because Barton needed an attendant pulled off the central array for at least 3 minutes. I made it most of the way down the corridor before I heard footsteps. I let my legs go. I did it properly, the way Vargas had taught me to fall once, years before, when Vargas was still Vargas and was still teaching anyone anything. I went down hard. I let my head hit the wall on the way. I let my body go into the half-seizure that any zoo head can produce on demand, because half of us produce it without meaning to 3 or 4 times a week, when our chemistry catches up with us. 2 attendants came. I felt the brush of their robes against my face. I felt the cool of one of their too many jointed hands on my forehead. I let my eyes roll back. I let drool come out of the corner of my mouth. I let myself be what they had decided I was, a grain, a meal, a piece of bad meat that had gone bad earlier than scheduled. They lifted me. They began to carry me back the way I had come. They did not look at the central array. They did not look at Barton. They were doing what their training told them to do with a meal that had spoiled in the corridor, and their training did not include checking the array, because the array was supposed to be checked by other attendants on a different schedule, and the infinity did not cross schedules. The infinity were precise. The infinity were too precise. We had counted on that. Barton got the footlocker into the recursion array. He had 16 minutes and he used 14 of them because Barton was the kind of man who built in margin. He came down the corridor at a walk, not a run, because Barton was a man who had thought about this for 2 years and he was not going to spoil it by running. He passed me on the floor. He did not look at me. He went out the door. He went past Megan. He nodded at her without slowing down. Megan was at the switch. The switch was not a switch in the way you are picturing it. The switch was a panel set into the wall of the inner ring corridor, 3 meters outside the clinic door, that controlled the secondary power feed to the maintenance bay below the clinic. The footlocker Barton had planted needed that secondary feed to make a circuit it could not have made on its own. Megan's job was to flip the panel exactly when Barton cleared the door, because flipping the panel while Barton was still inside would have killed Barton along with the rest of it. We had not discussed that part. Megan had understood. Megan had always understood. Barton cleared the door. He nodded. Megan threw the switch. The footlocker did what the footlocker had been built to do. It did it quietly because Barton was a precise man and he had not wanted us to be heard outside the clinic. The recursion array stopped. The chairs stopped. The cooling stopped. The soft, pale, shell-colored walls did not even flicker. They simply went still because the infinity ran their walls off the same array as the chairs, and when the array died, the walls died with it. The attendants who were collecting me stopped collecting me. Their dimples stopped pulsing. They stood very still in the middle of the corridor, and one of them made a sound I had never heard before, a low keening that came out of no mouth I could locate, and the other one folded his too many jointed hand against his chest in a gesture I did not understand and have never understood. They did not attack me. They did not move at all. They were infinity, and infinity without recursion was infinity without the thing that made them infinity. They were waiting for a loop that was not coming. I got up off the floor. The first thing I noticed standing was the silence. The hum of the recursion array under the floor was gone. I had not realized until that moment how loud it had been. The whole clinic had been vibrating at a frequency just below conscious hearing, and now it was not, and the absence of the sound was so loud it felt like a hand on my chest. The second thing I noticed was the lights. The walls had stopped being walls. They were not dark. The infinity did not run their walls on darkness, but they were not the soft pale shell color any longer either. They were a gray. A flat, dead gray, the color of a hand when the heat goes out of it. The third thing I noticed was the doors. The 3 doors I had walked past on the way in, the ones with the small windows at head height, were still closed. I made myself walk past them again. I made myself look in. The old hand on the armrest of the first door was not moving. It was not moving in the particular way a hand stops moving when there is no longer anything inside the person to move it. The young hand on the second door, the one with the wedding band, had fallen off the armrest and was hanging in the air, palm up, fingers slightly curled. The woman's hand on the third door had closed into a soft, loose fist. I made myself look at all 3 of them. I made myself count them. Then I made myself walk on, because if I had stopped to grieve in that corridor, I would still be standing there now. I walked past the 2 attendants who had been carrying me. They were still standing. They were still not moving. I walked past the door attendant. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, and his dimples were not pulsing in any pattern I had ever seen, just a slow, random twitching like a man's eye when he has not slept in a week, and he did not look up as I went by. I walked out into the inner ring. Megan was there. She took my arm without looking at my face, and we walked back through the 3 back routes the security drones did not patrol, and we did not speak for the whole walk, and we got back to the compartment, and we bolted the door. Barton was already there. He had a bottle in one hand and a piece of paper in the other. The paper had a name on it. The name was his daughter's name. He had been carrying that paper, folded in his pocket, for 2 years. He did not show it to us. He just held it. He drank the bottle. He went to sleep on the floor of our compartment, because he did not want to be alone in his own quarters that night, and Megan got a blanket and put it over him, and she sat on the edge of the cot, and she put her hand on my face, and she did not ask me if I was all right, because she knew I was not, and she did not need me to lie. I did not sleep that night. I sat on the cot next to Megan, and I watched Barton breathe on the floor, and I listened to the station hum its low hum around us, and I did the count in my head. 3 doors, 3 hands, the old man, the young man with the wedding ring, the woman with the soft, loose fist. I did not know any of their names. I would never know any of their names. I had walked past them, and I had not gone in, and I had not even tried. The least bad thing available had been to leave them in their chairs. I had told myself that for 11 days while we built the footlocker. I told myself again, sitting on the cot, and I would tell myself again every night for years after, and the telling did not make it any easier. The telling did not make it untrue either. Both things were the case. It was the right thing to do, and I had done it, and it had cost 3 people I would never know the names of, and the cost was mine to carry, and I have carried it. That is the part that the men who come after me need to understand. The win was real. The cost was real. You do not get one without the other. The infinity did not understand that. The infinity thought a clean victory was possible because their whole biology was built on running an hour 10,000 times until it came out clean. We are not built that way. Our victories come out dirty. Our victories come with 3 hands you walked past. You learn to live with that, or you do not. And if you do not, the infinity will have you eventually anyway. I learned to live with it most days. The infinity came for us eventually. Not that night. Not even that month. The infinity moved on infinity time, and infinity time was slow, because they had eternity to plan in, and they were used to recursing the same hour 10,000 times before they made a decision. But they came. They came for Brace 9 3 months later, and they shut down the refugee block, and they took the names of everyone who had been in the inner ring on the morning of the burn, and they began going through those names one at a time. My name was on the list. Megan's name was on the list. Barton's name was on the list. We were not on Brace 9 when they came for it. How we got off Brace 9 is somebody else's story, and somebody else has earned the right to tell it, and I will not tell it for them. What I will say is that the recording on Barton's disc had gone, by then, to other stations. Quietly. The way things go between humans who have nothing left but each other. The recording had gone to a man on Tycho 6, who knew a woman on Halsey 4 who knew a man on a slow freighter, and by the time the infinity began going through their list of names, there were already 3 other clinics on 3 other stations, where things had stopped working in ways that the infinity could not explain. The infinity did not understand what was happening to their harvest. They were a species built to recurse. They were not a species built to be surprised. We were a species built to be surprised. We had been doing it to ourselves for 10,000 years. We knew how to handle it. I am old now. I am older than a zoo head has any business being. My memory is patchy in places, because the Zoots took what they took and they did not give it back, but in other places it is sharper than it has any right to be, because the loop, on its way through me, did something to the parts of my mind I bit through. I remember the morning on the hauler. I remember it better now than I did before, because in the loop I lived it 500 times, and even the infinity drinking off the top could not eat all of it. The light on the side of my face. The bitterness of the coffee. Hoss handing me the cup and calling me kid. I remember it the way it actually happened, not the way the infinity wanted me to keep remembering it. I remember that after Hoss handed me the cup, I spilled half of it on my boot. I remember that I swore. I remember that Hoss laughed at me, a short hard bark of a laugh, and that he said something about all kids being clumsy and all clumsy kids growing into men if they were lucky. The infinity had edited the spill out on the very first pass. They had taken it because it was an imperfection, and they did not understand that the imperfection was the part that mattered. They did not understand that humans do not remember our best days the way they were. We remember them the way they were, plus the spill, plus the swear, plus the laugh. That is what makes them ours. That is the part the infinity could not loop, because the infinity were not built to imagine that a good morning could have a stain on it. That is why we are still here, and the clinics are not. Megan died 11 years after the burn. She died of a thing in her chest that no doctor on any station we made it to could fix. She died holding my hand, and she did not say anything dramatic at the end, because she was not a dramatic woman. She said, in that same flat voice she had used the day she pressed her thumb against my forehead, that I had better keep going. That is what she said. You had better keep going. I kept going. I am still going. I am sitting now in a compartment on a station whose name does not matter, talking to a recording disc that is the cousin of the one I once swallowed, telling this story for the men and women who come after, because the infinity are not gone, and the clinics will come back in some form, and the Zoots will come back, and there will be more zoo heads, and they will need to know what we knew. What we knew is this. They will tell you that your best day was perfect. It was not. They will tell you to hold the perfect version in your mind because that is the version that heals. It does not. The perfect version is the version they can drink. The version they cannot drink is the one with the spill on your boot and the swear under your breath and the laugh of an old engineer who has been dead now longer than I was ever alive before I met him. Hold that version. Hold the stain. Hold the bad coffee. Hold the part of yourself that knows your name, even when nobody is left to say it. Barton said it best the last time I saw him, before he went out the airlock on his own terms on a station I will not name. He looked at me, and he was older than the bottle in his hand, and he said the Infinity made one mistake. He said they thought we wanted the good parts. He said we never did. We wanted the parts that were ours. I think about that most nights, when the lights in the ceiling hum the frequency that the rest of the station cannot hear. I think about Hoss and the spilled coffee. I think about Megan's thumb against my forehead. I think about the dimples on the smooth, shell-colored heads of the attendants, pulsing slower and slower as the array died, waiting for a loop that was not coming. My name is Charlie. I was a zoo head. I bit my way out. That is enough.